have you ever really thought about what happens after an accident? I mean, beyond the immediate event. There's always this huge legal question looming. Who is actually responsible? Well, today we are going to untangle this incredible legal puzzle known as the chain of causation to figure out how the law decides who's really to blame.
You'd think it would be simple, right? An action happens, an injury follows. But the law is almost never that straightforward. It has to find a clear, provable link between the two. So how on earth does it do that? That is the big question we're going to dig into today. To get our answer, we're basically going to run a kind of legal gauntlet. We'll kick things off with the basics of the blame game, then we'll get into the fundamental but-for test. We'll see what happens when that simple test just isn't enough, and ask if an outcome was just, too bizarre to hold someone responsible. And finally, we'll see how this whole chain of blame can be completely and dramatically shattered.
All right, first up, the blame game. Before any court can even think about assigning blame, it has to forge that first, absolutely crucial link in a very important chain.
This right here is the core idea. I want you to picture a literal chain. The very first link is the bad act, the wrongdoing, and the very last link is the damage. The court's job is to prove that every single link connecting them is solid, because if even one link is missing or broken, the entire case can just fall apart. So how do they start? How do they test that very first connection?
Well, they start with something called the basic but-for test. This is the bedrock, the absolute foundation for establishing fault, and it's a beautifully simple yet really powerful place to begin. The question the court asks is this: would the injury have happened but for the defendant's action? Let me put it another way. If we could hit a rewind button on time and just erase the defendant's negligent act from history, would the injury still have happened? If the injury disappears, boom, we've got causation. But if it still happens, well, then we don't. And you don't just have to take my word for it. The legendary judge Lord Denning put it perfectly. It's a test of necessity, right? Was that negligent act necessary for the harm to even occur? This quote just nails the simple, clean logic at the heart of the whole thing.
Let's see how this plays out in the real world. In the case of Burnett, 3 security guards drink some tea that, unbelievably, was laced with arsenic. They go to the hospital, but a doctor on duty was negligent and just sent them home. Tragically, one of them died. But here's the twist. The court found that even if the doctor had done everything right, the poison was so far along that the man would have died anyway. So you apply the test. Would the death have happened but for the doctor's negligence? Yes. The chain was broken before it even got started. So the key takeaway is being negligent isn't enough. Your negligence has to be the actual cause of the damage.
Okay, but what happens when life gets messy? Because let's be honest, it usually is. What if there isn't just one single cause, but a whole bunch of them? This is where that simple but-for test starts to fall apart. To handle these more complicated situations, the courts developed a much more flexible rule. If you can't prove the defendant's action was the only cause, you might still win your case if you can show it materially contributed to the harm. This is key. It doesn't have to be the main cause, or even 51% of the cause. It just has to be a real, significant part of the story. Check out this case. A factory worker got a lung disease from breathing in silica dust. Now, this dust came from 2 different machines. The dust from one, a pneumatic machine, was basically unavoidable. But the dust from the other, a grinding machine, was only there because the dust absorber was broken, which was a breach of the law. The court had no way to know how much dust came from which machine, but it didn't matter. They ruled that because the guilty dust from the broken machine materially contributed to his disease, the employer was on the hook for the whole thing.
But there's a limit to this rule. In the really tragic Wilshire case, a premature baby sadly went blind. Now, there were 5 different possible causes for the blindness. A doctor's negligence was only one of the 5. Here the court said, nope, the material contribution test doesn't work here. It's fine for multiple sources of the same thing, like the dust in the last case. But it doesn't work for multiple different potential causes. You can't just say negligence was one of several possibilities. You have to prove it was a real contributor. Okay, so let's say we've established a factual link. We're not done yet. The law has another hurdle, which I like to think of as a foreseeability filter. It asks, was the final outcome a reasonably foreseeable result of the action, or was it just some kind of complete and utter fluke? And the law on this has really evolved. The old rule, from a case called Re Polimus, was, it was harsh.
It basically said if you were negligent and could foresee any little bit of damage, you were on the hook for everything that happened next, no matter how bizarre or unpredictable. The new rule from the famous wagon mound case is way more fair. It says you're only liable for the kind of damage a reasonable person could have seen coming. So this new test has two parts. One, the damage has to be a foreseeable consequence of the act. But two, and this is the crucial bit, the type of damage has to be foreseeable. In the wagon mound case, a ship's crew negligently spilled oil into a harbor. Now, it was pretty foreseeable that the sticky oil would cause some gunk and seepage damage to the nearby wharf. What they said wasn't foreseeable, though, was that welding sparks would ignite that oil and burn the entire wharf down. The type of damage, this massive fire, was just too remote, too unforeseeable from simply spilling oil. But here comes a huge and kind of famous exception to that whole foreseeability thing. And honestly, it has the best name in all of law, the eggshell skull rule. What it means is simple. If your victim is unusually fragile or vulnerable, well, that's your problem. You have to take your victim as you find them, eggshell skull and all. You can't use their hidden weakness as a get-out-of-jail-free card. This case shows the rule in action perfectly. An employer's negligence led to a worker getting a small burn on his lip. Now, a small burn, that type of injury is totally foreseeable. But, and no one knew this, the worker had a precancerous condition. The burn triggered it, the cancer spread, and he died. The court said the employer was liable for his death. Why? Because the initial type of injury, the burn, was foreseeable. The fact that the extent of that injury was completely off the charts and unforeseeable didn't matter one bit. So, we've got a factual cause, the harm was foreseeable. You'd think we're done, right? Not quite. Even now, the story isn't over. The chain can still be broken by one final dramatic twist. The law calls this a novus actus interveniens. It's a fancy Latin phrase for a new act intervening. If this new event is so powerful, so independent, and so unforeseeable, it completely snaps that chain of causation. It frees the original person from being liable for whatever happens next. Now let's look at a classic case where the chain was not broken. Picture this crazy scene. Somebody throws a lit firework into a crowded market. It lands on a stall. The owner, in a panic, grabs it and throws it away. It lands at another stall. That owner does the same thing. Finally, it explodes right in someone's face. The guy who threw it first tried to argue that the other people broke the chain, but the court said no way. Their actions weren't calm, free choices. They were instinctive, predictable reactions to the danger he created. It was all considered one single continuous act. So an instinctive act from somebody else might not break the chain. But what about the injured person themselves? Well, if their own actions are totally unreasonable, they can be the one who shatters the link. And that's exactly what happened in this case, McHugh v. Holland. A man's leg was injured and made weak due to someone else's negligence. A few days later, knowing full well his leg was unreliable, he tried to walk down a steep flight of stairs that didn't even have a handrail. Sure enough, his leg gave out. He jumped to avoid tumbling down the stairs and ended up breaking his ankle. The court decided that his choice to tackle those dangerous stairs was a new, unreasonable act. He broke the chain himself. So the defendant was liable for the original leg injury, but not for the broken ankle. So as you can see, legal blame is not a straight line. It's a chain, and every single link has to be tested for factual cause, for foreseeability, and for any crazy intervening acts. Which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. If blame really is a chain, how strong do you think those links should be? It's a tough question, and it's one the law is constantly trying to answer. Thanks for digging into this with me today.